morning, everyone. We're going to go ahead and kick off our breakfast. Thank you so much for coming. I'm Jen Faulkner. I direct the Master of Science in Government Analytics program here at Johns Hopkins University. And we co-host this Government Analytics Breakfast Forum with REI Systems. We meet about once every other month. And the purpose is to bring together professionals and academics in the government analytics space to form sort of a community of people to talk about the challenges associated with performing government analytics in the public sector. Our distinguished speakers today, we have two, which is a treat. We'll present for about 30 minutes or so, and then we strongly encourage your participation afterwards. We want these meetings to serve as really a discussion, so we very much want you to participate and ask questions, but I think we'll wait to do questions after your presentation as opposed to throughout. Does that work for you? Yep. Also, welcome to those who are joining us via the live stream, and you are very much welcome to ask questions as well, and there's a place for you to enter your questions in below the little video box. We also encourage you to tweet about our forum. You can use the hashtag GAB Forum, and there will be a recording of the event that will be posted on both the Government Analytics website as well as the REI Systems website about 24 hours after the event. If you want to share the recording with any of your colleagues, that's wonderful. So thank you very much for taking some time out of your day to participate. And now my colleague from REI Systems will briefly introduce our speakers.
Thanks, Jen.
Yeah.
I want to add my thanks to everybody that made it through the traffic and the heat today. I am John Gruitt from REI Systems. Generally, I would be Jeff Myers, but they let him take vacation this week, so somehow it fell through the cracks. But it's actually fallen to me, and it is my pleasure to introduce both of our speakers today. The first is Hyun Kim. She is the program manager for data.gov within GSA. Data.gov, as many of you are probably already interacting with, is a site that manages, depending on how you count them, about 400,000 open data sets. You can break those out further or clump them together even more. So that's her current experience. Previous to that, she was at the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, as well as serving as counsel to the 9/11 Commission and as Assistant General Counsel to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Ms. Kim holds a BA from Yale University in economics and a JD in law from the New York University School of Law. She also says that she's a big tennis fan and has completed the Grand Slam, and will be doing 3 out of 4 again this year. So, welcome. So that we don't interrupt the flow, I'm also going to go ahead and introduce Rebecca Williams. Prior to joining Government Excellence, which is a program in sociology here at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, she worked on federal data management and actually has also interacted with data.gov as well. She helped build the Sunlight Foundation's Municipal Transparency Program and has worked on a variety of civic issues as well. She holds a JD from Western New England Law School and has participated in Joint Masters of Regional Planning Program. One other fact is apparently that she likes biopics and noodles. So with that, I will turn it over to our distinguished speakers and let's get started. Thank you.
Family, because REI has been our application support contractor for many years, and Rebecca is a former colleague from the data.gov program. The only complaint is that time was too short, but people will figure out somewhere else to be together again. I didn't really focus on government analytics, but data.gov being the federal government's open data site, it ends up being something that you can apply to anything since it's government data, so whether it's like government analytics or big data, it's almost suitable for any conference I found. So I'll present an overview of it. Anything that you have with questions, I'd be happy to get into anything that I don't cover in the general overview of the program. So this is something that I pulled together for a recent internal talk because I'm always saying about how government data touches every aspect of life. and that on any given day that you look at any headlines or any major story, that behind it you will see a government data set. And we were having a internal forum about this, so this was in March, and I spent about 2 minutes looking at what the headlines were that day. And that's all it took to find at least 3 stories that once I clicked through it ended up having a government data set as a source. So there were stories, not surprisingly, about the rise in heroin use and how that breaks out by race, and about the increase in premature deaths in the U.S. due to the opioid epidemic. And then I went to a business site and then found that there was a story that day talking about what are the smallest cities in America that are also the wealthiest, because they were looking at sort of some retirement areas. And when you delve into the story, you find government data sets. So the health ones were based on a recent medical study, and then when you go to that, you find out that it's based on a National Institute of Health data set. Same thing with death rates, with a report from the Center for Disease Control, and then the small towns in America and their levels of wealth, of course, was based on census data. So data.gov has been in existence since 2009. It was launched in May of 2009, and it was part of the Obama administration's Open Government Initiative. So the origins of it are from a government executive order on transparency and openness in government that was issued in the first day of that administration. And of course, data being a big part of it, there was a subsequent memo that required the formation of data.gov and for agencies to identify high-value data sets that they would contribute to this catalog. So within a matter of weeks, really, the first version of data.gov was launched in May of 2009 as a metadata catalog, which it still is today. So it's about open government data sets that are hosted on the agency websites, but with the metadata being in a central place. So of course, the fact that there were many open data sets was not new, but the fact that there would be a central federal catalog was the new wrinkle on open data. And so after that, it grew, pretty steadily, with agencies contributing metadata for their data sets, but in a centralized way where agencies would fill out a metadata template about a particular data set and then send it to the data.gov program management office within GSA, and then we added it to the catalog. The big sea change on all of this was in 2013 when there was an executive order to make government data open and machine readable by default. So instead of this ad hoc way where agencies would contribute metadata for particular data sets, there was now a requirement through the executive order and a more detailed policy from OMB, which we just referred to as the open data policy, that agencies keep a metadata inventory of all of their data assets in a particular metadata schema, and to have that available for harvest. So instead of a push model where agencies would submit metadata, we went to a pull model where data.gov is now a catalog that pulls from these metadata inventories that are maintained by the agencies at all times. So here's just a screenshot of the catalog, which is the heart of the site. Then you see that right now there's about 190,000 data sets. As John mentioned, there is a trickiness to the number in that the data set total that you see there also includes collections. So if there are similar data sets, in a collection, so it could be multi-year series of the same data set, for example, that's grouped as a collection, that will count as one in that 194,000 number. So if you look at the total resources, total individual resources in the catalog, I think it's approaching 10 million Here's some other sort of baseline metrics. So as I mentioned, it's about 190,000 data sets with close to 10 million resources, 9,000 of those being available through APIs, and with 166 agencies and sub-agencies, as well as state and local sources. So the focus of the Data.gov program and the catalog and the program management office is of course the federal agencies that we work with on a daily basis to harvest these metadata inventories. But because of that model is pretty flexible, in that if state and local data catalogs provide the same type of metadata inventory in a similar format, it's very easy for us to just add it as a harvest source as well. So right now we're a little over 50 state and local, so it's state, city, county data catalogs. And of course it's on a voluntary basis because we don't have any authority over the non-federal sources, but if they choose to make their metadata available, it's very easy for us to include it. And it's pretty steadily growing in that I would say almost on a weekly basis we either find out about a non-federal data catalog going up, or somebody from a city or state in touch with us saying that they'd like to know more about how to do this and be included. This is just a sample of the metadata page for any particular data set, and it has some arrows going to some of the features. So as you can see, as I mentioned, the data sets are hosted on usually on an agency website, but if they provide a download link, the user doesn't have to go to the agency website, they can access it directly from the data set page. And in a couple of cycles ago, in the continuing OMB oversight of this, we placed some emphasis on making sure that agencies have very detailed or access and use information, because people have questions about, what am I allowed to do with this data set? And for most federal government works, there really aren't any restrictions at all. So that's a feature that we make prominent so that people know what that there really aren't limits on federal government data sets. What we have to be a little bit careful about those, because we present the non-federal sources in the same catalog and sort of in the same look. We try to make a point of emphasizing that for states and cities where they have different terms of use and different policies, that users are aware of the differences between federal and state. And there's one area where we've grouped all the non-federal sources together, so you can see that right now it's about 10,000 data sets from the state and local sources. So the heart of the site, of course, is the data catalog, but there are some other, there's a lot of other content on data.gov where we feature some of the more examples and use cases of the data. Here's the screenshot of the application page that we also updated fairly recently to show apps that have been created either by federal agencies or by outside developers, where we can trace the usage of a federal data set. But I think this is an area, really where we could use a lot of improvement, because while we've been focused on the implementation of the policy and making sure that the catalog is functioning smoothly and is getting updated and growing, I think there's a little bit of a shortfall on featuring the impact of the data, the usage, and showing the examples. And part of it, I think, once we talk to anybody who's working on this, it's actually not that easy to do an up-to-date job of showing the examples, because when we've done a little research on it, it's not obvious from looking at apps or other developments on open data, like what government data sets people are using, and sometimes there can be private sector entities that might not be, as open or obvious about what government data sets that they're using, probably, could be for legitimate reasons. So it almost seems like it takes someone to do full-time as an effort to do a good job of showing what the examples are, the impact, and how it's directly affecting solving everyday problems, creating economic activity, and all that. And part of it also is that our program management office is very small. I mean, it's 3 of us as full-time equivalents, and the day-to-day sort of making sure that the site is running, working with the agencies to make sure that these metadata inventories are up to date and getting harvested. It ends up taking the bulk of our time and resources. So I think part of the solution might be to work with some of the outside groups that are also focused on open data, so that may be an approach that we take to do a better job in showing the impact. The screenshot of our GitHub page. So for the last several years, since we launched the current version of data.gov in 2013 and 2014, we've done all our work in the open. So our GitHub repository has all of our code and all the issues that we're working on at any given time. So that's just something that's become default for us and for many other programs at GSA that you're familiar with. The other thing that's happened by virtue of us working with agencies to implement the open data policy is that, to a certain sense, we provide some shared services and have identified the need for more shared services, basically. So when the open data policy was issued, and agencies now have this new requirement to keep a metadata inventory in this prescribed format, there were some agencies that didn't have a resource to easily do that. Our catalog is based on an open source technology called CCAN, which is the most popular technology, I think, for data catalogs that are currently out there. And because we already had an instance of it for the catalog, it was easy for us to create a separate instance to use for the agency metadata management if they didn't have a tool already to do that. So we have a separate site that is not public for the most part called inventory.data.gov. And so what that does is give the agencies a easy tool that they can sort of put their metadata about their data sets into it, and it's already set up to produce the output that's exactly what they need to be harvested by the data.gov catalog. So let me just show you. So this is a screenshot of that non-public system. So this is what the page for a user that's an agency user managing the inventory looks like. So this is a GSA data set. So if I've signed in as a GSA user, I would see that the metadata that follows the schema that's required by the open data policy is there. And this is what it looks like for the user if I've signed in and I need to edit any of this. And since the fields are already tied to what the open data policy requires, it makes it pretty easy for an agency that doesn't have anything else to produce the metadata inventory. It's also helped us a lot with the smaller agencies, in that the open data policy is something that's still a requirement for CFO Act agencies, but not the smaller independent agencies. And for these smaller agencies that might have a handful of data sets, us having this system makes it very easy for them to just get an account and either add data sets or update what they've already put into the catalog. This is a screenshot of another shared service that we haven't gotten quite as far on, and that is the data.gov help desk, and it's basically a lightweight CRM because we are a central catalog, we get a lot of questions and requests about data sets from all across the government. So actually quite a bit of our time is also spent on dealing with public inquiries. So this is a system to basically manage that and to assign the questions and requests to the agencies that actually own the data. The pace of public questions requests has also picked up in the last couple of years, and we just looked at some information from 2016. I think that we were at about 2,200 inquiries that came into data.gov because people see it as a central location for federal data, and then we route it to the right agency that can act on it. Just a note about the governance of all this. So as I've mentioned, the executive order and open data policy are what primarily are the drivers for both data.gov right now, and also the agencies contributing the metadata. And that really hasn't changed, and we don't expect any change in the sort of the continued compliance effort from OMB and making sure that agencies continue to make their metadata inventories of all of these open data sets available. So due to the fact that we have to work with all the agencies and the open data leads, it's created a community that meets regularly to either go over what the latest requirements are for the open data policy or share best practices, give presentations on what is happening at all the agencies on open data. So we have bi-weekly meetings that have participation from like 60 to 70 people, and it's something that we co-host at GSA with OMB. We also manage a listserv for open data that is up to about 900 .gov email addresses, and that in the last several years, along with the meetings that we have, has become sort of the go-to resource within government for making announcements about open data and asking questions. So pretty much on a daily basis, I see activity in the listserv where people are saying, I have this issue with an open data question or problem, has some other agency dealt with this? And then you'll actually see 3 or 4 responses right away from other people on the listserv. Another policy area that we're going to be focusing on is trying to make the work of all this less about purely open data, but recognizing that the open data policy and the fact that agencies have to have metadata inventories is really a data management requirement, and something that arguably already our agencies are already required to do. So we're going to try to look at the effort that we're doing in open data to see how does it relate to other requirements that are on agencies. Is there anything that is sort of duplicative behind these different policies where we can consolidate some of the effort that is on all of these agencies, especially with challenges and resources of trying to make sure that we aren't collecting or putting in duplicative requirements that are really basically behind the same idea about proper data management. The other thing that we're keeping an eye on is that there is legislation that has been introduced in both the House and the Senate that would make the open data policy core requirements, basically saying that there has to be a data.gov and that agencies have to maintain metadata inventories to be harvested into the catalog to make that statutory. There's a lot of activity in trying to make that happen, and that certainly would be a big change for us, and something that we clearly support, and so we'll just keep an eye on where that goes, on whether that becomes a statutory requirement. That would probably be a boost to both us in the program and also for the agencies that are continuing to work on open data. So we have a contact page and a very easy to remember contact page address. We've also get a lot of inquiries on Twitter, so if there are any questions that come up, as I mentioned, we're a small program management office, so the emails are only going to go to about 2 to 3 people. You'll find us. So I'd be happy to take any questions after the presentation, or you can find us every time on the contact page. Yeah.
Can I get a sense of timing for how long we should be talking? I don't want to talk too long.
Well, we have until 10.
Okay, and then we'll do questions after. Okay.
Yeah, so you got time. Good time.
Okay, great. So my name's Rebecca. I used to work at data.gov, so it was a challenge not to want to also talk about data.gov in this presentation. But I'll find a way. So my background, mentioned at the beginning, was I did law and city planning. I was actually working as a city planner in New York City when Mayor Bloomberg passed his open data law in 2012. So I was working at a nonprofit regional planning association for folks that might care. And I was really excited that there'd be more access to government information because it was always based on personal relationships. Sometimes I'd have to copy and paste data into a spreadsheet or retype it, which I'm sure everyone at Hopkins understands. Prior to that actual city planning work, when I was a graduate student, it was 2008, 2009, and I was doing my thesis work on the foreclosure crisis. And I was doing it in Massachusetts, and the Registry of Deeds in Massachusetts is an elected position. And to get the foreclosure information, you'd have to query by 3 locations at a time, and then toggle through on the page. You can download bulk information on foreclosures. And I'd reached out to the Registry of Deeds, and I was like, I'm a graduate student. Can I have this information for my research? And they were like, no, it's too controversial. So I spent 9 hours toggling through and copying and pasting this foreclosure information. This is all to say that I was a data user, and I understood the frustrations of using government data and got really energized and activated by this wave of open data policy making. To the point where I came to Washington, D.C. to work on it as a cause issue. So where am I at now, and also it's relevant to Hopkins folks. So I work in the sociology department. I go to Homewood campus every Monday for our all-staff meeting, but I generally work from home or on the road, but I work on the What Works Cities initiative. The What Works Cities initiative is a project based in the Bloomberg Philanthropies suite of services. Bloomberg does a lot of different city work, but this is specifically based on capacity building for mid-sized cities. So mid-sized cities in What Works Cities land is, those are the partners, here's some cities, is anything between 100K and 1 million people. So the idea here was that the New Yorks and the Chicagos and the LAs are really starting to use data and evidence in their decision making, but some of these smaller cities aren't using these practices yet, so how do we get them up to sort of a base level understanding of how to use data in their decision making. In terms of the actual initiative, there's 5 different partners. So I'm here at GovX, the Center for Government Excellence at JHU. The other 4 are Results for America, Sunlight Foundation, Behavioral Insights Team, and Harvard Kennedy School Government Performance Lab, and we all do different partner offerings. So briefly, Results for America is working on quote-unquote repurposing for results, so seeing where funding is being allocated on government programs that's not working, hitting the pause button there, and then reallocating funding to other areas that might work better. Sunlight Foundation works on open data policy. I actually used to work there too. That's what got me to Washington. The Behavioral Insights team does nudge-based behavioral insights like A/B testing, and Harvard Kennedy School works on outcome-based contracting. So it's all different ways to sort of apply data and evidence, hopefully up to a decision-making level that affects residents. That's our tagline. We want to make sure that it actually affects outcomes for people. GovX works specifically on performance management and analytics, and then open data implementation. So a lot of what I'll be talking about is, okay, so open data is a thing in government now. New York passed their policy in 2012. I think DC was the first city to have a quote-unquote open data policy in 2009 or 8. And data.gov's been around since 2009, even before there was a policy. So this is a thing that governments are doing. but how successful are these programs, and how is that being measured? Another just like quick highlight, so this is from What Works Cities, and this is specifically some projects that GovX, my office, has worked on. So different like inventory examples or policies. These are with cities like Lincoln, Nebraska, and Salt Lake City, and Norfolk, Virginia. I'm gonna go to Columbus, Ohio next week for a site visit. So lots of different specific open data programs to measure. So when we're measuring the success of open data programs, I think it's an important thought exercise, like why are we opening data to begin with? How do you measure success? Why is it happening? And this is just something I did like very quickly. There's a few buckets that people talk about when they talk about why you should be providing government data to the public. This first column, the right to know, is more of like a moral or rights-based argument, and certainly the work that I did, the Sunlight Foundation, it's the idea that the public has a right to see records, they have a right to participate in democracy, sort of like government has to show their work. This is important for transparency and accountability. It's also the framing that the Obama administration originally did for data.gov and other things. And there have been many other arguments for reasons to open data since. The other buckets that I would describe are sort of this better government bucket, and there's like an argument about who makes government better with this open data. Is it just internal agencies that didn't have access to the data before? Is it external partners? But the idea being that if you're sharing more government information, that information will refine a bunch of different things. So there'll be cost savings in sort of sharing the information, there'll be new insights, new efficiencies, like shared knowledge will just end up producing better policies and programs within government itself. And then there's sort of this broader, I called it like a greater good or subsidy model. So the government collects this data anyway. And since we are taxpayers, this data should be made available for the public so business can create it into profit. So researchers can create it into their own insights so that non-US residents can sort of observe this data and that there's some sort of greater good being created from providing this information. I think like if you get into some of the more specific reasons, like each one of these bullet points you could come up with metrics for, and you probably want to refine it even more narrowly. Like if the government was opening data to reduce crime, you could talk about performance management metrics for crime reduction and how data sort of gets there. But I think it's important, and I think it's good, that this right to know, like moral, rights-based argument has been sort of the foundation of the open data movement, but it's also explains why a lot of the metrics around open data success have been really broad and sort of vague, because you're talking about if it's rights-based, then you're supposed to have all the data available, like you're supposed to be able to see everything. So it just gets very broad very quickly, and how do you get to a point where if I'm a government that thinks that open data is important, how do I share all of the data that can like safely be made open? So I guess that also gets to the point, what are the hurdles to open data? So what would you be measuring against? And those are just costs and various risks, and these are going to be subject to much legislation going forward. We're still figuring out what should be made private and what should be made public. Specific costs, you could do like a return on investment analysis for producing like a very large NOAA set. I'm going to talk about federal data, local data. The return on investment for having body cams and storing that data, and what the actual outcomes are, and what the after effects that you might not have wanted from having all that body cam info is. So there are these other things that you can measure against for your open data programming. Again, a lot of these measurements aren't really happening in sort of a holistic government program way, but you could, if you wanted to, apply metrics to a specific outcome that you wanted and then specific risks and costs associated with getting there. So like just a high level, like what do we want for open data metrics? I think, again, since it's a right-to-know based argument, you want to get to 100%, which is sort of this impossible brass ring. Like, we want all the data open, so what gets us to 100%? We need baselines, so this inventory process is something that we advocated for at Sunlight. It's something that the federal government has done. It's something that the majority of our What Works cities have done and the majority of the larger cities have done. So on your way to publishing data online, the first step is to inventory all the data you have. This probably isn't surprising to anybody in the audience, but this is so, so true. Governments don't know what sort of data they're collecting or where it is or how it's housed, and that's like true across the board from like a very small city to the federal government. Like the first step is knowing what you have to talk about disseminating what you have. And I think a lot of these inventory efforts are also helpful for cybersecurity issues because a lot of folks don't know how their sensitive data is being stored or maintained. So coming up with baselines and then coming up with not just quantitative, so like what data sets, like what's a data set, are being published, but the quality of those data sets. And then since the object is opening all the data, you need to prioritize on the way there. So if you're prioritizing publishing a variety of data sets, how do you identify the priority? And a lot of that has been not done at all. It's sort of ad hoc, like whatever agency wants to participate gets to like put their data online. If there's an outside stakeholder that is a little bit louder than other folks, it's like the what is it? The squeaking wheel gets the oil. Is that the phrase? So it's been sort of ad hoc. Folks that have done it a little bit more structured have done essentially like a cost-benefit analysis, like how much does it take to get out there versus either impact or also demand. So folks are really demanding this, and then they compare it against costs, and I'll go into that a little bit. But these are like very high-level models, and again, I think most of the cities I'll show are the bigger 10 cities that are too big for What Works Cities land. But we have a couple small city examples. But with so many governments applying these open data programs, it's really a shame that they're not measuring their open data success with data, because there's some opportunity there. So measuring open data policy progress, so this is probably the biggest area. So as I mentioned, a bunch of governments have started having open data policies, and then they have certain deliverables written into those policies. So they'll have, within New York City, they had within 3 years we're going to inventory all the data. And they would have updates along the way, so they have these deliverables and they just apply certain like performance management metrics to that goal. The city that has done this the best, in my opinion, is San Francisco, and I'll use them a lot in this presentation. But if you go to, datasf.org/progress, they have a variety of resources up top as well. If you go to the resources page where they have agencies fill out specific plans, but this progress tab is specifically how effective they're being at creating agency open data plans and then inventorying their data sets, and then publishing data sets based on that inventory. It bears mentioning like all of their work is open source, so should the city also want to have the same dashboard or apply the same metrics, they could in theory. Yeah, so they measure, and I think this is this is real time based on whatever the agency is publishing, pulled from their large their city portal, so you can see progress. I tried to show, I'm going to show a couple like PDFs of like policy metrics for like internal metrics that they're setting. But the benefit, of course, here is if you're measuring progress publicly, it's just incentive to agencies to actually do progress because everyone is seeing where you're at. But then also these open government groups and the public generally can see where you're at in progress of the policy. Okay, so measuring open data costs. So this has been a lot vaguer. maybe cost is always the biggest, like economists are always having to come up with a reason to measure cost. But in open data land at the local level, this has been done a couple different ways. So I have Philadelphia here. They just had a simple rubric 1 to 5, and they had agencies sort of estimate the cost of either extracting or publishing or all of the different things that might contribute to disseminating a government data set online. But it's just a 1 to 5 rubric that they had the agencies themselves fill out, so not a lot of oversight, not a lot of detail, but it did give them this framework to say, okay, well, these data sets seem a little bit easier to push out versus these other ones, and a way to prioritize. This is Montgomery County. So Montgomery County, very local, probably the most thorough in sort of the prioritization scheme for open data release in the country, like more so than the feds, more so than any city or state. They have a pretty comprehensive plan this is 2014, they're implementing it now, but they came up with 5 different priority levels with a variety of internal and external benefits and costs. So this is another example of just sort of how do you set a framework for prioritization once you have that initial inventory of data sets that exist in the world. Measuring open data demand. So here is a Sunlight Foundation is starting to do tactile data engagement pilots at a variety of levels as part of their What Works Cities partnership. So this information is actually from Glendale, California, where they went in and looked at different public records requests and saw what the most popular were. Public records requests being sort of this proxy measure for like what the public actually wants to see that they can't see. Of course, there's like a relationship between public records and then open data access. In theory, anything that you could request via public records should be made available public if it could be online. In reality, I think some of the public records requests processes act as another layer of friction that I think sometimes the public, say journalists, and often the government like having it take a little bit longer and a little bit harder. So I think that you're going to see continued new policy making between FOIA and public records and then sort of these open data policies. But for Glendale, for what it's worth, like the highest requests were building safety related by real estate private sector interests. This is pretty much with a lack of metrics. So another thing is a lot of local governments don't keep FOIA or public records request metrics to begin with. Like they don't know how many each agency gets, they're just not measuring it. But for local governments that are, I would say like almost consistently across the board, the public records requests are real estate associated in the private sector, real estate companies looking for various building information. So this isn't atypical, but so what Sunlight was doing here with their quote-unquote tactile data engagement is trying to identify specific demands so that Glendale could in the future prioritize their dissemination based on those demands, the public records being one way to measure demand. Here, this is Philly again. So once they had Philadelphia's rationale for doing the inventory wasn't even necessarily about taking stock of what Philadelphia had for other purposes. The main purpose was we need a list so then the public can provide feedback about what they want. So we need a list and then the public will directly tell us, like, based on this list of data sets, what is the most important to them. They just implemented this program, but they had it several years ago too. Several years ago it was called the Open Data Race. I'm not sure what it was called recently, but they partnered with a bunch of nonprofits and various external stakeholders and said, here's a list of data sets, tell us what you would do with it. So they would, for example, there'd be like a bicycle data set, and the bicycle nonprofit would say we could do this sort of analysis or this policy making or this app or this, but they would say what they would produce with the data set, and then that would be presented online, and then they had the public vote on like which of these projects is most appealing to you. Do you really want the bike app? And then various members of the public would vote, and then If the bike app got the most votes, then the bicycle data set would be like first in line to get out the door and be published online. So they have a very specific framework for discovering feedback that isn't based on public records requests. Other like proxies for demand are, I'm sure it's like data.gov/contact or any sort of contact means that you have around government data. Web analytics, so if you have specific reports, government reports that are getting the most action, those should be prioritized to have open data, so like structured, downloadable, high quality, real time, reusable data. So, other things that have been measured. So, measuring open data quality, hasn't been done enough. San Francisco is doing it. Specifically, San Francisco right now, they're doing a few different things in terms of quality. So, the way they've defined quality is not just like how updated it is, but also any sort of context or usability. So they do usability testing on their data sets. They're doing a government-wide effort right now to provide a consistent data dictionary. This is light years ahead of all the other governments, including New York City. New York City recently passed an open data law to make sure that their GIS, or the geographic geospatial data, was consistent. So just as simple as like making sure that their addresses were the same format across all the agencies. New York City's huge. They use like dozens of different types of address standards. So making sure that you're standardizing the geospatial information just across even your government, not talking sort of nationwide standards. But so quality is like the next round of a lot of the open data talks. If you go to international government open data talks, a lot of the talk before was like, we will open data and all these good things will happen. But now it's like we've opened the data and we haven't really seen the results of these things, but a lot of the issues are that the data that is available isn't necessarily high quality. And then also some of the next steps that you'd have to do around releasing the data, like providing the context, actually talking with the stakeholders, all of the work that goes into it hasn't been done, so sort of optimizing to make sure that that is done, so then you're seeing results. And also with What Works Cities specifically, a lot of our agenda has been around, okay, we come from Bloomberg Philanthropies, we're talking to the mayor and all the high-level folks, what is your most important issue, and then we're going to apply these practices to that issue. So Mesa, Arizona, for example, we went, homelessness was their big issue, so we were like, okay, we're going to come up with performance management metrics for homelessness, and we're also you're going to open all the data related to homelessness and put it online and engage with stakeholders. So like very specific, narrow, this is your issue area, now we're going to try to get results from that. With the idea being, one, you'll get results from that, but then two, this is a prototype or process that you understand that if you want things to change in your city, you have to use data and evidence and sort of these practices to be successful in that way. So that when the next issue comes up, then you're sort of applying these same practices. So progress, the other thing that has been measured is use. Use has been a little tricky, so this is from Pittsburgh, or the Western Pennsylvania Regional Data Center, something, C something. So use has been sort of a tricky thing. A lot of, or the open data communities, or the advocates, is part of wanting access to government information. You don't want to necessarily be tracked at the same time, so there's been some talk of like what is right and wrong for government to do in terms of tracking use of open data. I think generally web analytics are not seen as super invasive on any sort of government website, but then if you get to a point where you're having to log in to APIs with keys, or you have to like fill in a login information, and again this is friction, so maybe you do want that for sensitive information, but generally government open data, you shouldn't have to do anything, and the government shouldn't know that you're even doing anything with it. Is what an open data advocate would say, and I'm an open data advocate. So, some of the ways, so I used Pittsburgh here as the example because they did sort of the standard like, oh, these are specific data sets, and these are download times and page views and all the good web analytics stuff that you want. But then they went some steps further. So they specifically engage in programming around data literacy. So they go out and do these reach out efforts. So they're also measuring as a government and then posting it online publicly how often these data sets are being used in classrooms. And they're also measuring all the different ways that they reach out to the public. So a lot of governments aren't doing this, one, like the specific reach out, and then two, they're not measuring it. So now they can, with data, see like, oh, what are the most effective reach out efforts with their open data programming. Impact, this is the tricky one that I don't have good answers for. So this is the San Francisco logic model. So, I tweeted this set of slides. It's just a Google set of slides, so you have all the URLs if you want to check things out. If they haven't been clear on the screen. But basically the Chief Data Officer of San Francisco was aware that sort of open data impact has been gathered as like anecdotal, all over the place examples. So how do you sort of measure it more specifically? And she, like before What Work Cities existed, was also like, how do we make sure that we're measuring it as an outcome for someone in San Francisco? How do we make sure that this makes sense? They have a logic model that goes through various outcomes with the activities just being putting data online and the end outcomes being some sort of result to a human being. And then there's intermediate ways to get there. More specifically, in their strategic plan around impact, they have specific metrics on, a lot of it ends up looking like use. So the first way to sort of measure impact is sort of knowing who's using your data. This isn't clear at all, but the URL is online, so you can check it out. So making sure that you're not just yelling into a void when you're putting the data online, that you're getting to someone, and hopefully you're getting to target audiences. But again, target in like a very inclusive, open, non-surveillance type of way. So how do you make sure that you're providing all the information, that folks actually know what it says, that they're literate in what it says, and then they're actually acting with it. So one of the What Work Cities models, we have a standard, and it's commitment, measurement, taking stock or analysis, and then action. And a lot of this like next steps with open data is focused on like action. So where do you get after you actually have information? How does it affect policy? How does it affect other things? Further reading. So San Francisco, like I said, is sort of led in the local space. And they have a bunch of resources online. They also had this blog post that was kicking it off, like how to measure open data. The summary of this blog post is maybe like it can't be about data sets. So there's a lot of local governments for a while where it was like, are we successful at open data? Yes, we have 100 new data sets, but like data sets isn't clearly defined, and it doesn't matter if you have more data sets. What matters is actual outcomes for producing that data online. And they have this plan going forward about that. And then my organization, GovX, forked a lot of the San Francisco modeling, also federal modeling for metrics, and a couple other places, the International Open Government Community for the way they were measuring open data success, and we compiled it all into one handy resource, and that's the URL for that. And if you want to contact me, I'm very easy to reach. So.
Well, thank you very much to our presenters, and we have some time for questions. Do you guys have questions for either of our presenters? Yes?
I was wondering for data.gov, how does that interact with or compare to usaspending.gov?
Yeah, so we get a lot of questions on that. So data.gov is just overall open data sets that are made available by all the agencies about anything. usaspending.gov, as it exists today, gives you spending data about, how did the government spend money in, grants and contracts and whatnot. But of course, the big story there is the Data Act. So that is, so statutory requirement that there's going to be much more detailed spending information, exactly, with, because, you know, what existed up to date, you know, is very cursory sometimes, you know, it wasn't necessarily accurate, just the way, because there was just so many limitations on it. But now with the force of that statute and all the requirements of it, just on the standardization and sort of the completeness of the spending data, I mean, and we have colleagues in GSA who are working at Treasury to contribute to that effort. I mean, that it really should be a big step in having more granular data about exactly what happens with federal government spending.
Yeah, hi, I'm Patrick Garvey with Congressional Research Service. One of the things that we look at in trying to access data, we could talk for hours, and I'd love to. Clearly, the government collects data for its purposes. The purposes for research are many times very different than that.
Right.
So the data you need to measure performance, the data you need to measure accuracy or effectiveness of policy
Right.
is not necessarily contained in the data that the government's sharing or that the government's even collecting. As a manager, you're collecting data on X, Y, and Z, and if you understand what I mean. How do we get there?
You expect me?
Yeah. Do you have any policy suggestions on how we get to that? Or maybe Rebecca,
I
you've
have a
got ideas.
couple. Well,
Let's take a crack at it.
I don't know how we get. Well, okay. So 2 answers. One, I actually think that that's like a misnomer. I don't think government is always collecting information for themselves. I think sometimes they're accidentally collecting information. They don't even know what they're collecting for. So that's useful to everyone. That's useful to governments.
Mm-hmm.
That's useful to people outside of government. Probably like the easiest example is a lot of local governments. Any sort of like 3-in-1 request they get, they have that. They're not usually connecting it to anything else or even optimizing their 3-in-1. It's just like accidentally because of technology now.
3-in-1. I'm sorry. What was
Oh, 3-in-1. So like service requests, like
3-in-1,
non-emergency
sorry.
service
Got it.
requests that are usually like public works across the board.
Got it.
I've worked with cities specifically that like they'll now use the C-Click fix software that has more structured information, and they're like, oh, this is like really complete, and I could do all these things with it, and I didn't know that I was doing it before. But there's all these things that they're accidentally collecting. They're not necessarily using anything for. But this is why the inventory process is like very helpful. So. California passed a law last year that said all sort of databases need to be inventoried. So not at the data set level, but any sort of IT database for the entire state needs to be inventoried. Every city needs to produce it at the state level. And there's some version of this at the federal level, the IT portfolio, but like the more we sort of inventory what tech is being used in government, the more you're seeing that there's all this data associated with it. And again, like sometimes governments, they don't even realize that they have this sort of structured data trail, and sometimes they don't have data rights associated with it. So it's making sure that the government knows what's there, that the government has access to it, and then hopefully it's also on the open data list. That's like the first answer is just like there's some stuff being collected that has no intention. And then the second answer is, I think my personal take on this whole open data thing is I think initially a lot of folks thought like government has such high quality data and we're just going to create businesses and apps with it and it's just oil. But like one, the data isn't high quality, but or a lot of it isn't. Satellite imagery seems good. But some of it isn't high quality, especially at the local level. It's just it was collected for internal purposes that they actually didn't even really use very often and very siloed. So I think a lot of this dissemination effort is actually about improving the quality of the data. So again, encouraging local governments, like just put up what you have now. All of it could be better. And then engaging in this feedback conversation, like what are you actually collecting? This field would be helpful for me, but you're not collecting that. So I'm a researcher and this would be helpful. But also for many different things. So like in Chicago, they weren't collecting stop and frisk information for a while. Also they're doing a version of that in DC now. So ACLU couldn't sue on their stop and frisk program because there wasn't sort of this data argument that it was discriminatory because there was no information being collected. so it's not just like researchers, there's all sorts of like public interest in telling the government how their data needs to be better for them, not just for the government.
So this relates to a question that I had, which was, it seems like it'd be useful on data.gov, but also at the local level, to have an online space to formally bring together like researchers, either in the government or in private, in academia or private organizations with research projects that are going on in the public sector. It seems like those kinds of relationships happen ad hoc, it's a friend of a friend, and they pair together and they engage on a research project. Is there any effort to sort of formalize those connections? I think, because I've seen a website in academia appear that you put in your information and then people can come together and form collaborative projects. And it seems like that would be useful in the public sector.
Yeah, I was actually going to say, as a follow-up to the prior question, there's a long ways to go in trying to connect that. So in addition to the open data policy, there was a separate policy on federally funded research data, sort of making sure that data that's basically funded by taxpayer dollars is made open and available. And that policy has sort of been implemented in an almost separate path, because a lot of that data isn't on government sites, and it's in such a variety of locations. So there have been some efforts where this open data community of people who are at federal agencies working on the open data policy and issues, there has been some overlap, but we never actually really formally sort of brought those together, like for the requirement that federally funded research data, should be available to the public. Does that mean that should it be brought onto data.gov? I mean, people have asked that question, but we've never sort of brought those two streams together. And I mean, there's just a lot of work still to do there to even basically answer that question, because that's a whole other area that for us just on the open data policy implementation and that community that we're not very knowledgeable about, and it's just so massive. So our paths have crossed a little bit, especially sometimes on technical issues, because we're dealing with data set hosting challenges at different agencies, and then we find that for some agencies the question or need has arisen because they know that they have to comply with this federally funded research directive of making that open. So we've sort of interacted off and on, but we haven't really addressed that question of like fundamentally how is this going to get resolved and where should it all be.
So a quick response. I think at least at not everywhere, local level, federal level, internationally, I think the most success in sort of that forum-based or working group, I use group term, the most success there will be issue-based as far as I can see. So like in Seattle, we did like a housing affordability performance scheme based on a commitment the mayor already made that he's going to have affordable housing going forward, and then also made sure that the data aspect, and so that's like new collection, new anything, was tied to the public meetings that are already going on around housing affordability with those external stakeholders, and that their procurement was being updated in a way for homelessness services that related to the housing affordability. But it was just, there's already sort of this issue, there are already these stakeholders gathered, and making sure that a data person was there.
Yeah.
Quick question, because this is, you have data. When you collect data, you are collecting data that you define what the data could be useful from someone else. So there's a limitation of what you can open. So how are you able to open data to everyone when you collected the data for a specific purpose from someone and you're going to share that data?
Yeah. This is something that I think all governments are still figuring out. So Seattle is probably leading, but then also sort of candidly, I understand that they have a privacy policy, so thinking about this my data aspect, what should we be collecting from community members, and then what sort of rights do they have to disseminating that information later on. I think, where was I yesterday? oh, there's a panel yesterday and they're talking about the wild, wild west, like privacy implications, and it's like the correct term. Like there's a lot of sort of figuring it out right now. Also, for what it's worth, like just like to get like an international perspective, Europe has more consistent privacy rules for your information. In the US, we have the Privacy Act, and we have HIPAA, and we have FERPA, and we have sort of these siloed policies for specific things, but sort of just like general privacy policies are not super ubiquitous, or there's not one general blanket policy, and also we have like federalism. So there's all these like different privacy laws in every single state. So I think that is one of the hurdles to sort of disseminating anything, is having some sort of decision making. Like, say I'm Lincoln, Nebraska, and like what info do I put out and what don't I? You like look to the Nebraska laws, you look to some other cities to see consequences, but also there's like accidental legal implications. So the one open data lawsuit that I know of so far has been Philadelphia. They put out some gun permitting info. Turns out Pennsylvania, the state, has confidentiality on gun ownership rules. They had it out for like 3 or 4 days. They took it down. There's like a class action lawsuit. Philadelphia lost millions of dollars because you're not supposed to put who owns guns in Pennsylvania. But again, that's like different in different states.
So what you're talking about is created data that you create, not data you obtain from someone. Because you can create your data,
Yeah.
but not data you obtain from individuals. Like you develop data. So, because I can't see how you can share data. I just can't understand.
I mean, maybe we need to go through the question a little bit more, but like, so
Okay.
the gun permitting, like someone submitting that, and there's no sort of,
That's what I'm talking about here.
yeah, there's no specific scheme of rights that you have right now, I guess is the way I would put it.
It's just a very
Actually, yeah,
broad,
you're the
complex
privacy
topic.
attorney.
So just let me just make clear on, so the open data policy, the default, it says the default for government data should be, open and machine readable. But the policy is very clear that it's only talking about data that government agencies can release, because there is not some other limitation, right, on whether it's a law or regulation. So depending on what agency it is, it's not just privacy, there could be lots of other, laws and regulations on the particular topic that the agency deals with that limits making that data set open. So in that case, under the open data policy, what the agency does is it lists that data set as something that they have, but it makes very clear that it's restricted or not public. So for the inventory, it's listing it as, hey, this is something that we have, and might describe what it is, but it's not going to show up with a download link at data.gov, because there is no such thing. So
Because the difference is that in FDA, for example, I'm giving something very simplistic. If you FDA does they inspect or look at the testing of a fish, for example. They can share that data, but they can't share the data from a company that says this is how we test a fish.
right.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, and I mean, so that's one example, but every agency is gonna have some, and then when it comes to individuals, that's where the privacy questions come up, and it's a little challenging because, and it's also frustrating too, because people just sort of throw that term around, and that's not the same as what the Privacy Act actually is and says, because, people just sort of say that as meaning that, oh, if it's something about people, like you can't ever release it. No, like what the Privacy Act has is a framework where if you're collecting information that's identifiable by a person's name or an identifier, there are limitations, and if one agency that has it wants to disclose to another agency, then it has to be something that they've already said that they would do in a public notice and things like that.
I think we have a chance for one more question. Oh, sorry, yep.
There are some proposals about substantial cuts to federal agencies that I would guess, could affect
Yep.
data systems and data quality. So what kinds of things are you doing to assess this risk and mitigate it?
I mean, to a certain extent, what we can try to do more of is the shared services that I mentioned. So if by virtue of running data.gov, we run into something where GSA could provide a solution that ends up something that we could provide at no cost to an agency, then that's something we're sort of doing now anyway for this inventory system. But if there were certain other examples, that would be helpful. I think we're also looking at, even if it's something that we can't provide for free, by virtue of the open data work with all of these other agencies, have we identified a need where, because of what GSA has worked on or has developed expertise on, is there something where it would be cheaper overall if we had a solution where it was some sort of reimbursement agreement with another agency, but having one shared service would be much cheaper than 10 agencies trying to figure their way out to a common problem. So, I mean, we are trying to do that as much as possible, and that's not just data.gov, that's our entire, office in the Technology Transformation Service at GSA. But,
So,
that's
but
also
the-
not easy too, that,
Right.
you can't, there's burden in trying to figure out shared services and coming up with
But
reimbursable
those data
arrangements.
sets themselves, those things in the catalog, those things it could be that, like,
Yeah.
the previous speaker talked about, oh, we're just not gonna collect this data anymore because it has some other kinds of consequence. Or,
Yeah.
we're not funded to collect this
Right.
data. Are you gonna be keeping those old data sets up and will?
Well, the thing is that we're not keeping a copy, because what we are is a catalog that every night goes to see, oh, what's at, justice.gov for their metadata inventory. So the data.gov catalog is only going to have what the agencies maintain on a current basis. So as an example, if an agency had 100 data sets in their inventory, but for whatever reason, whether it was budget or something else, that was a smaller number the next day, the data.gov catalog would have gone to that website and updated, so it would be the current number of what they have. I will mention that we have worked with some outside groups that are interested in archiving and sort of like refuges for data sets that there's some concern about. So, we're certainly not the drivers in that, but, if sort of collaborating with them makes it easier for outside groups to do archives or keep mirrors of certain things, then, we're certainly happy to collaborate.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Give our speakers a quick round of applause.